Lost campers, believe it or not. Every now and then we stopped and looked ahead with my binoculars, hoping to see either the wagon trail or the lake or anything besides trees and trees and trees and fallen logs and underbrush and ferns and all kinds of wildflowers and more trees. Pretty soon Poetry, who had my binoculars, stopped dead still and exclaimed, Look, there it is, the trailer. What did I tell you? Come on, let's hurry up." It felt good to have that heavy load of being lost off of my chest, so I started to run too. Just then, just as quick, we stopped. For what we'd seen wasn't our nice cream-colored trailer with its silver top, but a cream-colored old-fashioned railroad car, right out in the middle of the forest. A railroad car! Had we lost our minds, as well as our sense of direction? A railroad coach in the middle of the forest. It couldn't be that, yet it was. We thought at first that there might be a railroad track there, that we could follow it in the right direction and come to a town and find out where we were. But there weren't any tracks, and hadn't been any, so we were just as lost as we were before. Poetry and I crept up kind of slow at first, until we weren't so afraid. Then we walked up to the steps at one end and knocked on the door. We knocked again, a half dozen times, thinking maybe somebody had bought the old coach from a railroad company and had moved it into the forest to live in. On the way up north, we'd seen some old coaches, just like this one, being lived in by people in some of the towns, and some were even used for roadside lunchrooms. Nobody answered our knock, so we tried the door to see if it was unlocked, and it was. In a jiffy, we were inside, where there were a lot of cobwebs, and the old-fashioned cane-back seats were covered with dust. The old green blinds at the windows were nearly all pulled down, making it a spooky place and filling our minds with a lot of cobwebbed ideas. We walked down the length of the coach, feeling all the time as though we ought not to be there, because it was somebody else's property. But we kept on exploring it because we like mysteries so well. All of a sudden, Poetry, who was in the lead, gasped and stopped. And I stopped too, I can tell you, for we saw something black between two of the old seats that were standing back to back. We could feel our hands trembling on each other's arms, and I could feel my feet getting ready to run. "What is it?" I stammered in a scared whisper. The light wasn't very good, because all the trees outside made so much shade and the blinds were down. Then Poetry whispered, "Wait." And I waited, listening for all I was worth so I could run quick if I had to. Poetry stooped over, and his being so big, the stooping made him grunt, which sounded like the grunt of an angry Indian. I could feel my hat moving on top of my red hair, which meant I was really scared. What in the... he began. He finished by dragging out something that made a heavy scraping noise on the floor. We stood looking down at it, feeling foolish, but still frightened, as if we were trespassing. "What is it?" I said, making the nerves in my body stop shaking. "It's an old suitcase," Poetry's squawky voice said. Well, we'd read in different newspapers about people who had been murdered, and their bodies had been stuffed into trunks or gunny sacks and things, and I could imagine most anything being in that black suitcase, for it certainly was a big one. We forgot about being lost for a minute, wanting to solve the mystery. "Let's open it," I said bravely, and see who's in it. Who's in it? Poetry's hand was just reaching down to take hold of the handle when I said that, but it stopped in midair and he looked at me with the strangest expression on his face. But Poetry was brave, even when he was scared, and besides, what was there to be scared of? It was just an old dusty suitcase in an abandoned railroad coach. I never saw any suitcase open the way that one did. It was fastened shut at the bottom rather than the top, and on the side of the bottom at that. But it wasn't locked, so after we'd grunted and pulled a little, it started to open. In another half second, it had been open if we hadn't been stopped. Stopped! We heard a noise at the end of the car where we'd entered. Then the old sliding door opened with a rusty squeak that sounded like a screech, and there, standing just inside the doorway, blocking the aisle, was a big bronze American Indian with his war bonnet on and long beads made out of bones hanging around his neck, a brass bracelet on his arm above the elbow, and another around his right wrist. In his hand he held a bow and arrow. There was a scowl on his face. And standing right beside him was a little boy with black hair hanging down in braids, and his face was as quiet as if he had been a statue. Well, those things happened in books, but they couldn't happen in real life. Not to the Sugar Creek Gang or to any members of it. It couldn't be real. The way everything was all mixed up, it couldn't be anything but a dream. Imagine telling directions by a stick and a watch, finding a railroad car out in the middle of a forest without any railroad tracks, a big black suitcase that opened at the bottom, and an honest-to-goodness Indian with beads and a war bonnet. In a minute I'd wake up, and I'd be back in my sleeping bag in Poetry's tent. To make it still more crazy, the little Indian boy didn't have a bow and arrow in his hand, but a broom. An actual broom and dustpan like the kind my mom used back home. And I tell you, I wished I was back in Sugar Creek territory, or else that I'd wake up. I didn't care which. Just when my knees started knocking together and I felt myself sinking down towards one of the seats, the big Indian smiled, and his teeth were beautiful and white. When he spoke, it was in good English, or I should say American. Good afternoon. What are you doing in my church? Church? That settled it. It was a dream, only it wasn't. Don't be afraid, the big Indian said. I won't hurt you. Snow in the Face here wanted me to dress up in an old-fashioned Indian outfit and pretend we were Indians of long ago. He smiled again. Want to see what is on the inside of the suitcase? You're the boys of the Sugar Creek Gang who are camping over on the other side of the point, aren't you? I know about you. Snow in the Face and I have been following you, thinking maybe you were lost. And we were going to help you find your way back to camp. Who are you? Poetry stammered. He was still scared, and I was still dreaming, I thought. I kept on half thinking that until a minute later, when the big Indian took off his war bonnet, laid it down on the seat, and said, Here, Snow in the Face, let me have that broom. I had to get busy if we wanted to get our church swept and dusted and ready for the meeting tonight. Little by little, we came to our senses, and this is what we found out. The big Indian was telling the truth. It was a church. The members of Santa Claus's church back in Chicago had bought an old railroad car and had moved it out into the forest on the Indian reservation to be used as a church, it being cheaper to buy a church building than to make one. Snow in the Face and his big brother, whose Indian name was Eagle Eye, were Chippewa Indians. Eagle Eye had become a Christian when he was 12 years old. and he had been away to school, high school, and then to a Christian college where he was studying the Bible and how to be a missionary to his own people. He had just come home for the summer and was going to have meetings in the old railroad coach. The members of Santa's church in Chicago were going to support him as their own missionary. If every church in the world would support just one missionary, the rest of the world would get converted quick, I'll bet. Poetry figured it up once, and he says it's so, and little Jim wishes it was. Well, it wasn't like getting out of a whirlwind alive to come out of all that tangled up mystery without getting hurt. Camp was just on the other side of the point from us, Eagle Eye said, and he'd drive us around there after a while if we'd help him clean up his church. The old wagon trail was just south of us a little way. Like to see the suitcase? Eagle Eye asked again, and he lifted it and carried it down to the other end of the coach where there was a little platform. He opened it up, and it wasn't a suitcase at all, but a little folding organ with keys and pedals and a rack for a hymn book and everything. It didn't take us long to finish the work, and then we drove back to camp in Eagle Eye's kind of old car, which was parked the distance of about 2 blocks away. We got there just about the same time the fishermen came in with a big string of walleyed pike. I took out my watch to see what time it was, and Poetry, who was in a very good humor, looked at me and said, "What direction is it?" 5 minutes after south, I said, grinning, feeling better than I had for a long time. Just that minute, Santa and Dragonfly and Circus and Little Jim came driving into camp, and for the first time, Snow in the Face smiled. He climbed out of Eagle Eye's rickety old car and shuffled over to the other one to get a sack of stick candy that Santa had brought for him, and which he must have been expecting. He and Santa seemed to be very good friends. We heard someone calling us from the dock about that time. It was Tom Till, standing up in the boat, which was in very shallow water, and holding up the biggest string of the biggest fish I had ever seen in my life. Making that little old 9-inch bass that Dragonfly had caught in Sugar Creek last summer seemed very small. Very, very small. You guys still awake, huh? Not only was there a big string of big fish, but there was one stringer on which there was just one fish that weighed 12 pounds. Wow! That northern pike had a mouth almost large enough to get a boy's head into it, and it had sharp teeth like a saw's teeth. Its nose was long and ridiculous looking. I couldn't help but wish I'd caught it myself so I could have had my picture taken with it, as Big Jim was having done to him right that minute, for it was he who had caught it. As I told you, Santa had gone to town to get some minnows, which they keep there in a live bait store, so that the rest of the gang could go fishing when the first boat full of fishermen came back. So now it was our turn, but there were still too many of us. It wasn't any fun to try to troll with more than 3 in a boat at one time, because the lines would get in each other's way. Finally, Barry rented another boat from the boat livery at the resort, so all the rest of us could go at the same time. Santa Claus took Circus and me in his boat, and Barry took Dragonfly and Little Jim in Poetry. Little Jim said he wouldn't fish, but would just go along for the ride. And he'd holler every time anybody caught a fish. That made poetry say, well, then we don't want you in our boat because we don't want you to be yelling every minute. Ha! Go over and get into Bill's boat so you can keep nice and quiet. Oh my. I had my dad's light steel pole with a reel and all the latest fishing equipment, although I didn't know how to use it very well. It was fun learning how, though. Santa showed me the best way to do it, and we were soon out on the lake, putt-putting over the waves. Riding in a boat on a lake felt like sitting in Mom's favorite rocking chair at home, except that the boat didn't only rock backward and forward, but sideways in every other direction, whichever way the boat turned. Sometimes it seemed it was rocking in a half dozen directions at once. All right, I think I'm going to stop there.